It's my pleasure to have another opportunity to speak to this bill in its third reading. And in my second reading speech, I touched on not only the elements of what makes a successful free trade agreement, but also the context under which they're then, I guess, for want of a better word, operationalised. And for me, obviously, the first starting point is for a successful FTA is that in the first instance it's well negotiated, that we work through some of the many and varied complications that these FTAs present. And you see in the detail of this one in particular, there's some interesting issues arising out of margarine at some point. And also there were exceptions in the FTA around the trade of alcohol and cultural and religious issues. So these are very complex FTAs that are being negotiated, and their success does revolve around the prowess of our negotiating teams. But secondly, I also had an opportunity to touch briefly on the environment under which our exporters operate generally in New Zealand and the economic framework, I guess, and the monetary policy which we have in New Zealand, which does have a significant impact on them as exporters, the volatility of our exchange rate in particular. And I do issue a challenge to the government to consider that issue if we truly are going to have the export-led recovery that they claim. So that's the second point I wanted to raise in relation to FTAs generally. And then the third is once an FTA has been agreed, as Stuart Nash and others have pointed out in this debate, it's not a matter of allowing that FTA to then sit on the table and just exist. There's a lot of investment that can go into making an FTA a success for our New Zealand exporters by supporting them, by boosting the investment in the NZTE to support them appropriately, by also making sure that we maintain our brand and trade off our brand appropriately off the back of these FTAs as well. So there are other elements that we may not be debating directly as a consequence, but are still incredibly relevant to our success as an exporting nation. I did really briefly, before I go on to talk about some of the impact of this, the economic benefits of this FTA, I did briefly want to touch on my disappointment at the way that the government members in particular have responded to the challenges that have been put up by the Green Party today. I think they were patronising at best and offensive at worst, and I think that we should always. Strangely, it wasn't even Paul Quinn on this occasion. I think actually John Hayes' contribution was he really outdid himself this time. In fact, but I'd have to say that I think that the Greens have raised some valid issues that are raised around trade almost every time we have this debate. And I think it demonstrates that we have a very valid discussion to be had. Thank you.
My clock's gone funny. And it came up with 2 minutes, and I thought, that's not right, but I did press the bell. We will sort out, and I will give the member another bell.
Just keep going continuously until the mechanics of the bell are worked out. I'd be happy to.
I will direct the member when her time has expired.
Thank you. Just to get back to the point I wanted to make is that when we discuss FTAs, I think the very valid issues around human rights arguments are rightly raised. And the first point I'd like to make on that front is that I support a rule-based a global system of trade, a negotiated and agreed rule-based system. But having said that, I think that it's also very valid that we do think about the implications for a broadening of free trade and the role that we have as a nation that has very strong labour laws, that is developed, around the impact that we can have on some of our trading partners who may not have entrenched in their systems some of the rules that operate in our own. So I am talking about a level of corporate responsibility being exercised in the way that we operate in some of those nations. I think if the small amount of time that we spend, the large amount of time, for instance, that we spend talking about how to better negotiate the free movement of butter was spent talking about how we globalise some of the most core elements of human rights, then we'd be a long way down the track to making some vast improvements to labour laws for a starting point globally. So just a small point on that issue. Coming back, though, to the economic benefits of this particular FTA, I think it's already been mentioned that Malaysia is New Zealand's 8th largest export market and totals about $1 billion in trade. Well, that was for 2008. Might be a useful comparison to point out that that actually helpfully is the same amount of debt that the government's adding to New Zealand in order to deliver their tax cuts from the last budget. So I think it probably points to the magnitude of both that export market and also that level of debt. So in fact, we've actually just wiped out the benefits of this FTA in one foul swoop, as it were. But between 2004 and 2008, exports to Malaysia grew quite significantly by 80%. And it has been estimated that this agreement eliminates tariffs to 99.5% of New Zealand's current exports by 2016. My understanding is that there are exemptions in that around alcohol, which I think I touched on briefly. And the percentage of estimated duties that New Zealand exporters would have to pay will be reduced by 86% by 2016. That is incredibly significant. And I think it is, though, useful to point out that when you compare that to New Zealand, there is duty-free access to 72% of imports from Malaysia. And I think it's worth making that point, that a lot of these FTAs, in particular the one with China, they were FTAs that were primarily beneficial to New Zealand in that regard. And there was a lot of discussion over whether or not that FTA should have been used as an opportunity for New Zealand instead to prove a point on its political position on democracy, labour laws, human rights, or whether or not we should proceed with an FTA with China. And it was an interesting debate to have, but I think at the end of the day, the point was well made that when you have, in the same way that we do for Malaysia, a situation where they already have very open access to New Zealand markets, that we are, in a sense, cutting off our noses to spite our face. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we do not still have a duty to ensure that those issues where they exist are still put on the table when the opportunity arises in in those diplomatic negotiations, or leader to leader, or however we choose. But I think that is the trade-off that was made in that particular scenario. I think that just to touch on finally, Mr. Speaker, there has been great discussion over the benefit of this agreement to Zespri in particular. I think they're an excellent example of where this agreement has been beneficial. I know that one of my colleagues is not as enthusiastic as kiwi fruit as I am. I undertake to Clayton Cosgrove to go and find out what benefit it will have for nectarines. I understand that is his fruit of preference. There is some passion for the nectarine. Also partial to the feijoa. So I will undertake to go and undertake whether or not that will have a significant impact. New Zealand steel lines, which currently face 50% tariffs, will be tariff-free. I would have thought that would be the perfect excuse for the government to perhaps reduce the enormous subsidies that they're putting in place for such producers via the ETS. I understand my generation will be covering off those subsidies for the next 50 years. So given we're removing tariffs for that particular industry, and they will make a cost savings for that, perhaps we could rebalance what is currently an ETS that has absolutely no incentives to reduce pollution built into it. That might be something that one of my other colleagues might like to pick up on in their contribution. But otherwise, I'd like to reiterate Labor supports this bill.
Dr. Paul Hutchins.